Lieutenant Buck Compton and Sergeant Bull Randleman were playing darts in a crowded English pub. Buck was having a difficult night, while Bull calmly continued landing his throws. The other members of Easy Company watched from nearby tables, enjoying the rare chance to relax before their next mission. A group of new replacements sat together on the other side of the room. When one of the men attempted to introduce himself to the veterans, he unknowingly took Private Babe Heffron's usual seat. The newcomers quickly discovered that the soldiers who had survived Normandy were not particularly welcoming. The veterans had lost too many friends to become immediately attached to unfamiliar faces who might not survive their first battle. Bull eventually challenged one of the replacements to hit the bullseye with a single dart, wagering 2 packets of cigarettes. The young soldier accepted, but Buck casually threw with his left hand and struck the centre of the board. George Luce pointed out that Buck was right-handed, leaving the newcomers impressed and slightly embarrassed. As the men continued drinking, they shared stories about their earlier missions. They recalled how Babe Heffron had once stopped beneath a transport aircraft bearing a painting of a beautiful woman named Darling Doris. Doris was also the name of the girlfriend who had sent Heffron a letter ending their relationship. Fortunately for Babe, the mission had been cancelled before he was forced to climb aboard the aircraft. The conversation soon turned toward Bull. Although some of the veterans joked about his slow country manner, they warned the replacements not to underestimate him. Bull Randleman was one of the most experienced and dependable soldiers in Easy Company. Tension briefly surfaced when one of the replacements asked about the Presidential Distinguished Unit citation worn by the men. The citation had been awarded to the regiment for its actions in Normandy. Private Cobb bitterly reminded the newcomers that they had not been there, when another soldier pointed out that Cobb had never reached the ground during the invasion because he had been wounded aboard his aircraft. The conversation threatened to become violent. First Sergeant Carwood Lipton interrupted before the argument went any further. He announced that Easy Company would soon be moving out again. The new operation was called Market Garden. It was larger than the Normandy airborne assault and would carry the paratroopers deep into the occupied Netherlands. Easy Company would land near Eindhoven, capture the town, and secure the bridges along the main road leading north. British armoured divisions would then advance through Eindhoven, Nijmegen and Arnhem before crossing the Rhine into Germany. The entire Allied advance had been reorganised to support Field Marshal Montgomery's plan. If the operation succeeded, Allied tanks might enter Germany and bring the war to an end before Christmas. Intelligence predicted little resistance. The German forces in the Netherlands were believed to consist largely of inexperienced boys and elderly men. The jump would also take place in daylight, allowing the paratroopers to land more accurately. Unlike several earlier missions that had been cancelled at the last moment, Lipton believed this one would proceed. The men were told to prepare to leave England behind. As Easy Company assembled for departure, Private Popeye Wynne unexpectedly returned from hospital. He had been wounded in Normandy and was still unable to sit comfortably, but he had left the hospital without permission rather than risk being reassigned to another unit. Although his injury had not completely healed, he insisted that he was capable of making the jump. The men were also surprised to see Captain Herbert Sobel, their former commanding officer. Sobel had been appointed the regiment's supply officer. When he spotted the motorcycle Sergeant Malarkey had acquired, he immediately reminded him that it remained the property of the United States Army. The replacements watched the exchange with curiosity as the veterans explained that Sobel had once commanded Easy Company before being promoted and transferred. The paratroopers boarded their aircraft and checked one another's equipment. One nervous lieutenant asked the sergeant behind him to tap his leg when the jump light turned green, despite being told that the light would be directly beside him. Bull helped the replacements arrange their weapons and equipment correctly, warning one soldier that the position of his rifle could cause the stock to strike his knee and the barrel to break his jaw upon landing. The aircraft soon crossed the English Channel and entered Dutch airspace. The jump proceeded smoothly, and Easy Company landed among open fields near Eindhoven. The men were surprised by the lack of immediate German resistance. Some even found fresh fruit waiting outside a nearby farmhouse, as though the Dutch residents had been expecting their arrival. Allied aircraft passed overhead, but German anti-aircraft fire soon drove them away. With their air support disappearing, Easy Company began moving toward Eindhoven. The paratroopers advanced cautiously through the fields, knowing that German troops could be hiding anywhere. When they entered the town, the soldiers were greeted as liberators. Dutch civilians crowded the streets, waving flags, offering food and celebrating the end of years of occupation. Women kissed the Americans as they passed, while children reached out for chocolate and cigarettes. Many of the soldiers were overwhelmed by the reception. Not everyone in Eindhoven was celebrating. Dutch resistance members were publicly punishing women who had formed relationships with German soldiers. Their hair was cut off as crowds jeered at them. The Americans were told that male collaborators faced a far harsher fate and were often executed. A resistance leader named Pius van Kooik offered to help Captain Winters secure the bridges and drive the remaining Germans out of Eindhoven. His contacts had reported that British armour was already moving along the road to the south. Winters accepted his assistance but remained cautious. He ordered scouts to watch the outskirts of town in case Easy Company had to remain there overnight. Some of the soldiers found shelter inside local homes. Webster and Van Klinken discovered a Dutch family hiding in an air raid shelter. The family had remained underground since the first Allied aircraft appeared. When they learned that the men were American paratroopers and that the Germans had apparently withdrawn, they cautiously emerged. The Dutch civilians asked whether the Americans intended to stay. Webster could only promise that they would remain for as long as necessary. The family offered the hungry soldiers food, while the Americans shared chocolate with a child who had never tasted it before. The following day, Easy Company moved out with British tanks toward the next objective. Lieutenant Robert Brewer moved forward as the lead scout. His men joked that he looked like General Patton and warned that he was presenting a perfect target. A sniper's bullet suddenly struck Lieutenant Brewer in the neck. The column was immediately thrown into confusion. Winters ordered the men to keep moving because the sniper was targeting anyone who remained stationary. The paratroopers spread out and advanced toward a farmhouse, firing into likely enemy positions. The resistance soon became heavier. German infantry appeared along the road, and a Tiger tank waited behind a building on the British flank. Bull warned the commander of a nearby British tank and asked him to fire through the building. The commander refused because he had orders to avoid unnecessary destruction and could not engage an enemy he could not see. Sergeant John Martin warned him that the Tiger would soon reveal itself. Moments later, the German tank emerged and opened fire. The British armour pulled back as shells exploded around the infantry. Easy Company scrambled for cover and attempted to withdraw through a ditch on the far side of a hedgerow. German machine gun fire swept across the field. Van Klinken was wounded on the opposite side of the hedge, and several men risked their lives attempting to reach him. Bull directed rifle grenades and machine gun fire against the German positions, but enemy infantry continued moving around Easy Company's flank. With the road near Arnhem cut and German troops closing in from several directions, the Allied column was forced to retreat. Winters ordered the men to fall back. The paratroopers withdrew under heavy fire, carrying their wounded wherever possible. During the confusion, one soldier was shot through both cheeks. Although the bullet left 4 wounds as it passed through his face, it missed anything vital. The men considered his survival almost miraculous. Bull became separated from the rest of his squad while helping the wounded escape. Miller, one of the replacements, was killed during the retreat. By the time Easy Company reached safety, 4 men were dead and 11 were wounded. Bull Randleman was missing. Captain Winters ordered the survivors to continue moving while the wounded were evacuated. The men learned that Lieutenant Brewer was still alive despite being shot through the face. He had apparently turned his head when Bull shouted a warning, causing the bullet to pass through his cheeks rather than striking him directly. Brewer was sent back to England and was expected to survive. Bull, meanwhile, remained behind enemy lines. Alone and injured, he hid inside a barn as German soldiers searched the surrounding area. When one of them entered the building, Bull waited in the darkness before attacking him with a knife. After killing the German, he concealed himself and remained silent until the danger passed. Back with the company, Bull's men refused to believe he was dead. They argued that without a body, there was no reason to assume the worst. Several volunteered to return through the German lines and search for him, but the risk was enormous. Eventually, a small group slipped away to look for their missing sergeant. The search party moved carefully through the dark countryside, listening for German patrols and watching the horizon as Eindhoven burned beneath an air raid. The town that had welcomed the Americans with flags and celebrations was now being bombed. Before the searchers could reach him, Bull left the barn and began making his own way back. He avoided German positions, crossed the fields, and eventually reached Easy Company's lines. His men were overjoyed to see him. They jokingly asked whether he had become lost, while Bull calmly replied that something like that had happened. One soldier admitted that he did not know whether to slap him, kiss him, or salute him. The men told Bull that they had been preparing to make a dangerous search for him, although they disguised their concern with insults and humour. Their reunion was brief. Easy Company was ordered to prepare to move again. Van Koik reported that the Germans were concentrating tanks near Wegel, meaning the paratroopers were likely heading into another armoured battle. The men bitterly joked about the intelligence reports that had promised they would face only old men and children. As the soldiers gathered their equipment, they struggled to accept that they were retreating. It was the first time Easy Company had been forced to give up ground. Reports from the north were equally troubling. The Allied advance had stalled, the road to Arnhem had been cut, and the British airborne troops were surrounded. Operation Market Garden had failed to open the promised route across the Rhine. Instead of ending the war by Christmas, the Allies would now have to find another way into Germany.